Naomi, a black girl, tells the judge that she's hungry in the courtroom. What he does next shocks everyone, and it's not what anyone expected. As the town watches in disbelief, the question remains, will this surprising decision bring about redemption or chaos? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Judge Richard Whitman sat tall in his chair, his stern gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The weight of his black robe seemed to match the heaviness of his responsibility. He'd been at this for hours, case after case, his voice steady and firm as he handed down judgments. "Next case," he called out, his tone leaving no room for delay. A young black woman stepped forward, her shoulders hunched and her eyes cast down. She looked tired, worn down by life's hardships. Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her. "Sheila Thomas," the clerk announced, "charged with petty theft." Judge Whitman nodded, his face a mask of neutrality. "Proceed," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. The public defender, a lanky man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Thomas, was caught taking expired goods from Joe's Grocery on Main Street. She—" "Expired goods?" Judge Whitman interrupted, his eyebrow raised. "Yes, Your Honor," the defender continued. "The items in question were past their sell-by date and were set to be thrown out. Ms. Thomas, a single mother, was desperate to feed her young daughter." Judge Whitman's gaze shifted to Sheila. She stood silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was a quiet dignity about her, despite the shame that colored her cheeks. "Ms. Thomas," Judge Whitman said, his voice softer than before, "do you have anything to add?" Sheila looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time. I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do. My little girl Naomi, she was hungry. I couldn't bear to see her go without food another day." The courtroom was silent. Judge Whitman felt something stir within him, a feeling he usually kept locked away when he was on the bench. He saw the tears glistening in Sheila's eyes, the tremble in her lips as she fought to keep her composure. "Your Honor," the public defender spoke up again, "Ms. Thomas has no prior record. She's a hard-working woman who's fallen on tough times. Her husband was wrongfully imprisoned 2 years ago, leaving her to raise their daughter alone. She's been struggling to make ends meet ever since." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He was known for his strict adherence to the law, his no-nonsense approach to justice. But as he looked at Sheila Thomas, he saw more than just another defendant. He saw a mother pushed to her limits, a woman who had been failed by the very system he represented. For a moment, the courtroom faded away. Judge Whitman thought of his own comfortable life, his fridge always full, his worries so different from those of the woman standing before him. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a mixture of empathy and shame. "Ms. Thomas," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "the law is clear on the matter of theft. However, the circumstances of your case are unique." Judge Whitman leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Sheila. "Ms. Thomas, do you understand the charges against you?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Sheila nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. Just then, a small voice piped up from beside Sheila. "We haven't eaten in days." All eyes in the courtroom turned to the source of the voice. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, sat next to Sheila. Her big brown eyes were wide and innocent, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden bench she sat on. Judge Whitman blinked, taken aback by the unexpected interruption. "Young lady, who are you?" he asked, his stern demeanor softening slightly. "I'm Naomi," the little girl replied, her voice clear and unafraid. "That's my mommy." She pointed at Sheila, who looked both mortified and heartbroken. The judge's gaze softened as he looked at Naomi. "Naomi, you shouldn't speak unless—" "I'm hungry," Naomi added, cutting off the judge's gentle reprimand. Her words hung in the air, raw and honest. The courtroom fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The simplicity and innocence of the child's statement hit everyone like a punch to the gut. Sheila's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back her sobs, her hand reaching out to touch Naomi's shoulder. Judge Whitman sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned. In all his years on the bench, he had never been so caught off guard. The child's words had cut through all the legal jargon and procedural norms, laying bare the human story at the heart of this case. He looked at Naomi, really looked at her. Her clothes were clean but worn, her shoes scuffed and a size too small. Despite her declaration of hunger, there was a spark in her eyes, a resilience that touched something deep within the judge's heart. Then his gaze shifted to Sheila, seeing her in a new light. The desperation in her eyes, the way she protectively wrapped an arm around Naomi, the visible weight of her struggles etched in the lines of her face. It all painted a picture far more complex than a simple case of petty theft. The courtroom remained silent, the air thick with emotion. The public defender looked hopeful, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The prosecutor shuffled his papers, clearly uncomfortable. And Judge Whitman, known for his unwavering dedication to the letter of the law, found himself at a crossroads. For a moment, Richard Whitman wasn't just a judge. He was a human being, faced with the stark reality of human suffering. The law suddenly seemed cold and inadequate in the face of a hungry child and a desperate mother. Judge Whitman sat in silence for a moment, his eyes moving between Sheila and Naomi. The little girl's words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. He cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual as he addressed the courtroom. "We'll take a brief recess," he announced, surprising everyone present. Without another word, he stood up and left the courtroom, his black robe swishing behind him. Whispers filled the room as people wondered what was happening. Sheila hugged Naomi close, her face a mixture of confusion and worry. The public defender leaned over, whispering words of reassurance, though he looked just as puzzled as everyone else. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours to those waiting in the courtroom. Finally, the door opened, and Judge Whitman returned. In his hands, he carried a brown paper bag. He walked up to where Sheila and Naomi sat, his face softer than anyone had ever seen it. "Here," he said gently, holding out the bag. "I thought you might be hungry." Sheila's eyes widened in disbelief as she took the bag with trembling hands. Inside were 2 sandwiches, apples, and bottles of water. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at the judge. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Naomi's face lit up at the sight of food. "Can we eat it now?" she asked, looking between her mother and the judge. Judge Whitman nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Of course. Please, eat before we continue." As Sheila unwrapped a sandwich for Naomi, the courtroom watched in stunned silence. This act of kindness from the normally stern judge had caught everyone off guard. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while the public defender looked on with a mix of surprise and hope. Naomi took a big bite of her sandwich, her eyes closing in contentment. "It's good," she said between mouthfuls, her voice muffled but happy. Sheila ate more slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. Her eyes never left Judge Whitman, a mix of gratitude and wariness in her gaze. She couldn't help but wonder what this unexpected compassion might mean for her case. As mother and daughter ate, Judge Whitman returned to his seat. He watched them, his usual stern expression softened by something that looked almost like concern. The weight of his decision seemed to hang heavily on his shoulders. The courtroom remained hushed, the only sounds the quiet munching of Sheila and Naomi. Everyone waited, wondering what would happen next, how this unusual turn of events would affect the case at hand. As Sheila and Naomi finished their meal, the courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations. People leaned towards each other, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes darting between the judge and the mother-daughter pair. "Did you see that?" one spectator murmured to another. "I've never seen Judge Whitman do anything like that before." "Maybe he's going soft," another replied, shaking their head in disbelief. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his notes, and then back at Sheila and Naomi. The public defender sat up straighter, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. When Judge Whitman called the court back to order, a hush fell over the room. He looked at Sheila, his expression softer than before. "Mrs. Thomas," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "would you like to explain your actions to the court?" Sheila stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Judge Whitman's. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "I know what I did was wrong. But I didn't know what else to do." She paused, glancing at Naomi, who watched her with wide eyes. "My husband, he's in prison. He was wrongfully convicted years ago. Since then, it's just been me and Naomi." Tears welled up in Sheila's eyes, but she blinked them back. "I've been trying so hard to make ends meet. I work 2 jobs, but it's never enough. The bills keep piling up, and sometimes there's just no money left for food." The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Sheila as she continued her story. "That night I saw the grocery store throwing out food. Good food that was just past its sell-by date. I couldn't bear the thought of Naomi going to bed hungry again. So I took it." She looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was wrong, but when you hear your child cry because her tummy hurts from hunger, you'll do anything to make it stop." Judge Whitman leaned forward, his elbows on the bench. "Mrs. Thomas, why didn't you seek help from local charities or food banks?" Sheila's shoulders slumped. "I tried, Your Honor, but the food banks in our area are overwhelmed. Sometimes there's just not enough to go around, and I was ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know how bad things had gotten." As Sheila spoke, the courtroom remained hushed, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Whitman listened intently, his usual stern expression replaced by one of deep thought and concern. Judge Whitman sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He looked at Sheila and Naomi, their faces etched with worry and hunger. For the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of his gavel like a boulder in his hand. He had always seen the law as black and white, right and wrong. But now, as he gazed at the mother and daughter before him, those lines began to blur. The judge's mind raced, recalling countless cases where he had handed down sentences without a second thought. But this was different. Naomi's innocent words echoed in his mind. "I'm hungry." Such a simple statement, yet it had shaken him to his core. He glanced at the little girl, her big eyes fixed on him, full of hope and fear. Judge Whitman felt a lump form in his throat. Then there was Sheila, a woman driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. Her story of struggle and sacrifice tugged at his heart in a way he had never experienced before. He found himself wondering what he would do in her shoes. Would he have acted any differently? The courtroom waited in tense silence as Judge Whitman wrestled with his thoughts. He had always prided himself on being a pillar of justice, unyielding and fair. But now, he questioned whether true justice could exist without mercy. His eyes fell on the law books stacked neatly on his desk. The familiar sight that had always brought him comfort now seemed cold and distant. The letter of the law was clear, but what about its spirit? Wasn't the law meant to protect people like Sheila and Naomi? Judge Whitman's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his gavel. He knew that whatever decision he made today would change him forever. Could he find a way to uphold the law while also showing compassion? Or would he have to choose between the two? As he looked back at Sheila and Naomi, he saw not just defendants but fellow human beings caught in a web of poverty and despair. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitman felt the full weight of his responsibility, not just to the law but to the people standing before him. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, his eyes moving from Sheila and Naomi to the prosecutor. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for his decision. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, his voice firm and unyielding. "The law is clear in cases of theft. We recommend the standard punishment, which could include jail time for Ms. Thomas." At those words, Sheila's face crumpled. She instinctively pulled Naomi closer, her arms wrapping protectively around her daughter. Naomi buried her face in her mother's side, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Judge Whitman felt a tightness in his chest, The thought of separating this mother and child tore at him in a way he'd never experienced before. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. "I'm hungry." How could he, in good conscience, punish a mother for trying to feed her child? He looked down at his hands, folded neatly on the bench. They were the hands that had passed down countless verdicts, always following the letter of the law. But now, those same hands felt heavy with the weight of a different kind of responsibility. Judge Whitman took a deep breath, his decision crystallizing in his mind. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Sheila and Naomi. "Ms. Thomas," he began, his voice softer than usual, "the law indeed prescribes punishment for the crime you've committed." He paused, noticing how Sheila's grip on Naomi tightened. However, the law also grants judges some discretion in sentencing, particularly when there are extenuating circumstances. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Whitman rarely deviated from standard sentencing guidelines. The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Given the circumstances of your case, Ms. Thomas, I believe that jail time would be an unjust punishment." Judge Whitman's voice grew stronger, more resolute. "Instead, I am sentencing you to 1 month of community service." Sheila's eyes widened in disbelief. Naomi looked up at her mother, then back at the judge, a glimmer of hope in her tear-filled eyes. "You will report to the community center every weekday for the next month," Judge Whitman continued. "There, you will assist in their food distribution program, helping to ensure that others in our community don't face the same hardships you've endured." Tears of relief streamed down Sheila's face. She hugged Naomi tightly, whispering words of comfort to her daughter. Judge Whitman felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he had made the right decision, one that balanced the scales of justice with compassion. As Sheila and Naomi left the courtroom, their steps were hesitant, as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Sheila held Naomi's hand tightly, her eyes darting around nervously, half expecting someone to change their mind and call them back. "Mama, are we really going home?" Naomi whispered, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. Sheila nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes, baby, we're going home." As they pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the bright sunlight, Sheila felt a mix of relief and uncertainty wash over her. The future was still unclear, but for now, they were together. That was all that mattered. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Judge Whitman sat alone at his bench, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He stared at the empty chair where Sheila had stood, replaying the events of the day in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of unease. The black and white world of law he had lived in for so long suddenly seemed filled with shades of gray. He had always prided himself on being a strict interpreter of the law, believing that justice was best served when emotions were set aside. But today, something had changed. Naomi's innocent words, "I'm hungry," kept echoing in his ears. Those simple words had pierced through his carefully constructed wall of impartiality, forcing him to see the human faces behind the cases he judged. Judge Whitman stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town he had served for so many years. He wondered about the other Sheilas and Naomis out there, struggling to survive in a system that often seemed blind to their circumstances. Was it really justice to punish someone for trying to feed their child? Was the law always right? Or were there times when compassion should take precedence? These questions swirled in his mind, challenging everything he had believed about his role as a judge. He had always seen himself as a moral arbiter, upholding the law without question. But now, he wondered if there was more to justice than simply following the letter of the law. Judge Whitman sighed heavily, feeling the weight of this internal conflict. He knew that this case would stay with him, forcing him to reconsider how he approached future decisions. The path forward wasn't clear, but he felt a growing conviction that true justice might sometimes require a more nuanced approach. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, Judge Whitman sat at his desk, unable to shake the image of Sheila and Naomi from his mind. The day's events had stirred something deep within him, a feeling he couldn't ignore. With a heavy sigh, he reached for his phone. "Hello, Mark, it's Richard Whitman. I need a favor," he said, his voice low and serious. "Mark, An old friend in the district attorney's office listened as Judge Whitman explained his request. The judge wanted to look into Sheila Thomas's husband's case, the one that had left her struggling as a single mother. "I know it's unusual," Judge Whitman admitted, "but something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." Over the next few days, Judge Whitman spent every spare moment poring over the files Mark had sent him. As he dug deeper into the case, he felt a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. Something was off. The evidence against Sheila's husband seemed flimsy at best. Witness statements were vague and key details didn't add up. The more Judge Whitman read, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Sheila and Naomi anymore. It was about a system that had failed an entire family. One evening, as he sat surrounded by stacks of papers, Judge Whitman came across a document that made his heart skip a beat. It was a police report from the night of the crime, one that hadn't been included in the original trial evidence. The report mentioned another suspect who had never been questioned. Judge Whitman's hands shook as he reread the report. How had this been overlooked? Why wasn't it part of the trial? As the pieces started to fall into place, Judge Whitman felt a mix of anger and sadness wash over him. Sheila's husband might have been wrongfully imprisoned, and their lives had been torn apart because of it. The judge leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about Sheila, forced to steal food just to feed her daughter. He thought about Naomi, growing up without her father. And he thought about all the other families out there who might be suffering similar injustices. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitman felt a deep sense of responsibility beyond just interpreting the law. He realized that true justice meant actively seeking out the truth, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. With renewed determination, Judge Whitman picked up his phone again. He had more calls to make, more questions to ask. He knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy, but he was committed to seeing it through. As he dialed the number, Judge Whitman felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could right this wrong and help Sheila's family find the justice they deserved. As the days passed, Judge Whitman found himself drawn more and more to Sheila and Naomi's plight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something, anything, to help them. One evening, after the courthouse had emptied, Judge Whitman made his way to the small apartment complex where Sheila and Naomi lived. His arms were laden with bags of groceries. He hesitated for a moment before knocking on their door, worried about how his actions might be perceived. Sheila opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw who it was. "Judge Whitman?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and concern. "Good evening, Ms. Thomas," he said softly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I brought some groceries for you and Naomi." Sheila stood frozen for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small and sparse, but clean. Naomi sat at a tiny table, working on her homework. "Hi, Judge Whitman," Naomi called out, her face lighting up at the sight of the grocery bags. As Judge Whitman set the bags on the counter, Sheila watched him with a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. The judge paused, considering his words carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do," he finally said. "You and Naomi deserve better than what life has handed you." Over the next few weeks, Judge Whitman made these visits a regular occurrence. Sometimes he brought groceries, other times school supplies for Naomi. Each visit was brief, but meaningful. During one visit, he noticed Naomi struggling with her math homework. Without thinking, he sat down next to her and began explaining the problems. Sheila watched from the kitchen, a small smile playing on her lips. As time went on, Sheila's initial confusion began to give way to cautious trust. She saw how Naomi's face lit up whenever the judge visited, how his small acts of kindness were making a real difference in their lives. But still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder about his motives. Why would a judge, known for his strict adherence to the law, go out of his way to help them like this? One evening, as Judge Whitman was leaving, Sheila finally worked up the courage to ask, "Judge Whitman, I'm grateful for everything you've done, but why us? Why are you helping us?" The judge paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He turned back to look at Sheila, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Because sometimes, Ms. Thomas, the law isn't enough. Sometimes we need to do more to ensure justice is truly served. With those words, he left, leaving Sheila standing in the doorway, more confused than ever about the enigmatic judge who had become such an unexpected part of their lives. As the weeks passed, whispers began to circulate through the small town about Judge Whitman's unusual involvement with Sheila Thomas and her daughter. At first, it was just idle gossip at the local diner, but soon the story caught the attention of the local media. One sunny morning, Judge Whitman arrived at the courthouse to find a small group of reporters waiting for him. Cameras flashed as he made his way up the steps, their questions ringing out in the crisp air. "Judge Whitman, is it true you've been personally assisting the Thomas family?" one reporter called out. "How can you remain impartial in this case?" another shouted. The judge paused, his face a mask of calm despite the turmoil he felt inside. "No comment," he said firmly, before disappearing into the courthouse. Inside, he found his clerk, Jenny, waiting with a concerned look on her face. "Judge, have you seen the morning paper?" she asked, handing him a copy of the local Gazette. The headline read, "Judge's Compassion, Justice Compromised." Below was a grainy photo of him carrying groceries into Sheila's apartment building. As the day wore on, the story spread like wildfire. The courthouse phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned citizens and curious journalists. Social media buzzed with opinions from both sides of the debate. At the local coffee shop, longtime residents argued over steaming cups of coffee. "It's about time someone in power showed some real compassion," Mrs. Johnson, a retired schoolteacher, said firmly. "But what about the law?" Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, countered. "If he bends the rules for one, where does it stop?" Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of town, families who had struggled like Sheila's felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. As the sun began to set, Judge Whitman sat in his chambers, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. He knew his actions had put him in a difficult position, but as he thought of Naomi's bright smile and Sheila's grateful eyes, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jenny again, looking worried. "Judge, there's a crowd gathering outside. Some are supporting you. Others, well, they're not so happy." Judge Whitman nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew that his actions had sparked a debate that went far beyond one family's struggle. It was about the very nature of justice and compassion in their small town. As he prepared to face the crowd, he couldn't help but wonder, had he done the right thing? And more importantly, what would this mean for Sheila and Naomi's future? Judge Whitman sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. His eyes were tired, but his determination never wavered. For weeks, he had been digging into the case of Sheila's husband, poring over every detail with a fine-toothed comb. As he flipped through the transcripts of the original trial, something caught his eye. A pattern began to emerge, one that made his stomach churn. The more he read, the clearer it became. Racial bias had tainted the entire proceedings. "Good Lord," he muttered, rubbing his temples. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The system he had devoted his life to had failed the Thomas family in the worst way possible. With a heavy sigh, Judge Whitman reached for his phone. He knew he needed help from someone who specialized in these kinds of cases. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello, Sarah? It's Richard Whitman," he said when a voice answered. "I need your help with a wrongful conviction case." Sarah Matthews was an old law school friend who had made a name for herself fighting for the wrongfully imprisoned. As Judge Whitman explained the situation, he could hear the passion igniting in her voice. "Send me everything you've got, Richard," Sarah said firmly. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Over the next few days, Judge Whitman worked tirelessly to compile all the evidence he had uncovered. He carefully organized witness statements, court transcripts, and his own detailed notes. Each piece of paper represented a step closer to justice for Sheila's family. As he worked, Judge Whitman couldn't help but think of Naomi's face. So young, yet already bearing the weight of an unfair world. He thought of Sheila struggling to keep her family together in the face of overwhelming odds. Their faces fueled his determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Whitman had everything ready. He called Sarah again, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "I'm sending you the files now," he told her. "What do you think our next steps should be?" Sarah's response was immediate and confident. "We'll file a motion to reopen the case based on new evidence," she said. "It won't be easy, but with what you've uncovered, we've got a fighting chance." As he hung up the phone, Judge Whitman felt a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Sheila sat on the worn couch in her tiny apartment, her hands trembling as she clutched a newspaper. The front page screamed headlines about Judge Whitman's involvement in her case. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the attention her family had suddenly received. "Mama?" Naomi's small voice broke through Sheila's whirling thoughts. "Are you okay?" Sheila looked up, forcing a smile for her daughter. "I'm fine, baby. Just thinking." But Naomi was perceptive beyond her years. She climbed onto the couch next to her mother, her big brown eyes full of worry. "Is it about the judge? Are we in trouble?" Sheila's heart clenched. She pulled Naomi close, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair. "No, sweetie. We're not in trouble. It's just complicated." Naomi snuggled closer. "I heard Mrs. Johnson next door talking. She said they might take me away from you." Sheila's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized Naomi had overheard such things. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's not going to happen. I won't let it." But even as she said the words, Sheila felt a wave of fear wash over her. What if they did try to take Naomi? The thought was unbearable. Naomi's little fingers gripped Sheila's shirt tightly. "Promise?" she asked, her voice small and scared. Sheila swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I promise, baby, we're going to stay together no matter what." As she held her daughter close, Sheila's mind raced. She thought of Judge Whitman's kindness, the way he had gone out of his way to help them. But now, with all the attention, would it backfire? Would the system she had learned to distrust so deeply now tear her family apart? Naomi's soft sniffles broke Sheila's heart. She gently wiped her daughter's tears away. "Hey now, remember what I always tell you? We're fighters, you and me. We don't give up." Naomi nodded, a tiny smile breaking through her tears. "Like superheroes?" Sheila chuckled softly. "That's right, baby. Just like superheroes." As they sat there holding each other tight, Sheila's anxiety mingled with a fierce determination. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would do whatever it took to keep her family together. As news of Judge Whitman's involvement in Sheila's case spread, whispers in the courthouse corridors grew louder. His fellow judges cast sideways glances at him, their faces a mix of confusion and disapproval. Whitman tried to ignore the mounting tension, focusing instead on the stack of files on his desk, evidence he'd gathered to support reopening Sheila's husband's case. One crisp morning, as Whitman settled into his chambers, a sharp knock on the door made him look up. His longtime colleague, Judge Patricia Harding, entered with a grim expression. "Richard," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk." Whitman's stomach clenched. He knew that tone. "What's going on, Patricia?" She sighed, taking a seat across from him. "The Judicial Review Board has called for an investigation into your conduct regarding the Thomas case." The words hit Whitman like a physical blow. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "An investigation? On what grounds?" "They're saying you've become too personally involved," Patricia explained, her eyes filled with concern. "Richard, you've been seen visiting their home, bringing them groceries. There are rumors you're working to reopen her husband's case." Whitman's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to right a wrong, Patricia. That family has suffered enough." "I understand that," she said softly. "But you're putting your career on the line." Some of your colleagues are accusing you of compromising your impartiality." The weight of her words settled on Whitman's shoulders. He'd known there might be consequences, but facing them now made his chest tighten. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There will be a formal hearing," Patricia explained. "The board will review your actions and decide if they warrant disciplinary measures." Whitman nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. His years on the bench, his reputation, everything he'd worked for. It could all be taken away because he'd chosen to show compassion. As Patricia left his chambers, Whitman sat in stunned silence. He thought of Sheila and Naomi, of the injustice they'd faced. He'd sworn an oath to uphold the law, but wasn't justice about more than just following rules? Wasn't it about doing what was right? The sound of the bustling courthouse outside his door seemed to fade away as Whitman grappled with the choice before him. Continue helping Sheila and risk losing everything he'd worked for, or step back and let the system he'd begun to question take its course. Despite the looming investigation, Judge Whitman refused to back down. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't abandon Sheila and Naomi now. With renewed determination, he dove deeper into his quiet investigation of Sheila's husband's case. Late into the night, Whitman pored over dusty case files and faded police reports. His eyes strained in the dim light of his study, but he pressed on. Each document he examined revealed new inconsistencies, painting a troubling picture of racial bias and rushed judgment. One evening, as he sifted through witness statements, something caught his eye. A key witness's account seemed to contradict the official police report. Whitman's heart raced as he realized this could be the breakthrough he'd been searching for. The next day, ignoring the whispers and stares from his colleagues, Whitman made a discreet call to a trusted private investigator. "I need you to track down Marita Johnson," he said in a low voice. "She was a witness in the Thomas case 5 years ago. Her statement could change everything." As days passed, Whitman's determination only grew stronger. He met with legal experts in secret, gathering opinions on the strength of the new evidence. Each conversation fueled his belief that Sheila's husband had been wrongly convicted. One rainy afternoon, Whitman received a call from the private investigator. "I found her, Judge," the voice on the other end said. "Marita Johnson is willing to talk." Whitman's heart leaped. This could be the key to unraveling the whole case. He arranged a meeting, careful to keep it off the official record. When Marita Johnson sat across from him, her eyes filled with regret, Whitman knew he was on the right track. "I've carried this guilt for years," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I saw what really happened that night, but I was scared to speak up. The police, they pressured me to go along with their version of events." As Marita recounted her true account of that fateful night, Whitman felt a mix of anger and hope. Her testimony could be the turning point in proving Sheila's husband's innocence. Despite the risk to his career, Whitman pressed on. He carefully compiled all the new evidence, building a compelling case for reopening the trial. The stack of documents on his desk grew, each page a step closer to justice for the Thomas family. The next day, Sheila paced nervously outside Judge Whitman's office, her heart racing. She had come to confront him about his continued involvement in her family's case, but now that she was here, doubt crept in. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Come in," Judge Whitman's voice called from inside. Sheila entered, her eyes meeting the judge's. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but he managed a small smile. "Mrs. Thomas, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair. Sheila sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Judge Whitman," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know, why are you doing all this for us?" The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "Mrs. Thomas, I believe in justice, and I believe that you and your family have been wronged by the very system meant to protect you." Sheila's eyes welled up with tears. "But your career, I've heard the whispers. People are saying you've gone too far. I'm grateful, truly I am, but I'm scared. What if all this makes things worse for us?" Judge Whitman leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sheila, I want you to understand something. I believe in your innocence. And more than that, I believe in your husband's innocence too. Sheila's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't dared to hope for so long. You do? Yes, Whitman nodded. I've been investigating his case, and I've found evidence that suggests he was wrongfully convicted. I know it's scary, but I promise you I'm doing everything in my power to make this right. Tears spilled down Sheila's cheeks. She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment and struggle had taught her to be wary. How can you be so sure? We've been let down so many times before. Judge Whitman stood up and walked around his desk, sitting in the chair next to Sheila. I understand your skepticism, Sheila. The system has failed you, and I'm truly sorry for that. But I've uncovered new evidence, including a witness who's come forward with information that could change everything. Sheila looked into Judge Whitman's eyes, searching for any sign of deception. All she saw was sincerity and determination. For the first time in years, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her heart. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Judge Whitman replied softly. Just know that I'm on your side. We're going to fight this together. Sheila nodded, wiping away her tears. She wasn't ready to fully trust yet, but she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, things could finally change for her family. Judge Whitman sat at his desk, staring at the letter from the district attorney's office. His heart sank as he read the words again. Request for retrial denied. Insufficient evidence. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of disappointment crushing down on him. Just when he thought he was close to proving Sheila's husband's innocence, this setback felt like a punch to the gut. He had worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that he believed was rock solid. But now it seemed like all his efforts were for nothing. Frustrated, Judge Whitman crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash. He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. For a moment, he considered walking away from it all. The stress, the sleepless nights, the risk to his career. Maybe it wasn't worth it. As doubt crept into his mind, there was a soft knock at his door. Come in, he called out, his voice weary. The door opened, and Sheila stepped in, holding Naomi's hand. The little girl's eyes lit up when she saw the judge. Mr. Judge, Naomi exclaimed, her smile bright despite the circumstances. Mommy said we should thank you for helping us. Judge Whitman's expression softened as he looked at the child. That's very kind of you, Naomi. How are you doing? Naomi's smile faded a little. I'm okay, but sometimes I'm still hungry. Mommy tries her best, but... She trailed off, looking up at Sheila. Sheila squeezed her daughter's hand. We're managing, Your Honor. Thanks to your help, things have been a little easier. As Judge Whitman looked at Naomi, he remembered her words from that day in the courtroom. The raw honesty of a child declaring her hunger had touched something deep within him, and now, seeing the hope in her eyes, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He stood up, walking around his desk to kneel in front of Naomi. Naomi, do you remember what you told me that day in court? The little girl nodded. I said I was hungry. That's right, Judge Whitman said gently. And do you know what? Your words made me realize how important it is to help people who are struggling. Even when things get tough, we can't give up hope. Naomi's eyes widened. Really? You mean you're not going to stop helping us? Judge Whitman glanced up at Sheila, who was watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. He stood up, his resolve strengthened. No, Naomi, I'm not going to stop. In fact, I'm going to work even harder to make things right for your family. Sheila's voice trembled as she spoke. But, Your Honor, we heard about the district attorney's decision. We understand if you can't do any more. Judge Whitman shook his head. This isn't the end, Mrs. Thomas. It's just a setback. We'll find another way. I promise you, I won't give up until we've exhausted every possible option. Judge Whitman paced his office, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew the risks: his career, his reputation. Everything he had worked for could be lost. But as he glanced at the photo of Sheila and Naomi on his desk, he felt a surge of determination. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd use. "Hello, Lila. It's Richard Whitman. I need your help with something important." Lila Jenkins was an old friend and a respected journalist. If anyone could bring attention to Sheila's case and her husband's wrongful imprisonment, it was her. "Richard, this is unexpected." Lila's voice crackled through the phone. "What's going on?" Judge Whitman's voice was steady as he replied, "I have a story that needs to be told. It's about injustice, racial bias, and a system that's failing the people it's meant to protect." Over the next hour, Judge Whitman laid out the details of Sheila's case and her husband's imprisonment. Lila listened intently, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "This is big, Richard," she said when he finished. "But are you sure you want to do this? The backlash could be severe." Judge Whitman closed his eyes for a moment. "I'm sure, Lila. It's time to shine a light on this injustice." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Lila worked tirelessly, interviewing Sheila, digging into court records, and piecing together the story. Judge Whitman provided her with all the evidence he had gathered, careful to stay within legal boundaries. As the story took shape, Judge Whitman braced himself for the storm that was about to hit. He knew that once the article was published, there would be no going back. The morning the story broke, Judge Whitman arrived at the courthouse to find it swarming with reporters. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in his face as he made his way inside. "Judge Whitman, is it true you've been investigating a wrongful imprisonment case?" "Your Honor, do you believe there's systemic racism in the justice system?" "Judge, are you prepared to face the consequences of your actions?" He pushed through the crowd, offering no comment. Inside, he found his colleagues waiting, their faces a mix of shock, disappointment, and anger. The head of the Judicial Review Board, Judge Harrison, approached him. "Richard, what have you done? This is a disaster. The integrity of the entire court is being questioned." Judge Whitman stood his ground. "I did what I believe is right, Thomas. Sometimes upholding justice means challenging the very system we serve." As the day progressed, the story gained traction. Social media exploded with discussions about Sheila's case and the broader implications of racial bias in the justice system. Calls for a review of her husband's case flooded the district attorney's office. By the afternoon, Judge Whitman received a summons from the Judicial Review Board. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle. But as he thought of Sheila and Naomi and all the others who had been failed by the system, he felt a sense of peace. He had made his choice. Now, he would face the consequences, knowing that he had stayed true to his conscience and the true spirit of justice. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Whitman strode in, his face set with determination. Spectators filled every seat, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Sheila sat nervously at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Naomi, wide-eyed and hopeful, sat just behind her mother. Judge Whitman approached the bench, a thick folder clutched in his hands. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I have new evidence that I believe warrants a full review of Mr. Thomas's case." The prosecutor, Mr. Jenkins, immediately rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. Judge Whitman has no standing in this case." The presiding judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Carlson, raised her hand for silence. "I'll hear what Judge Whitman has to say, Mr. Jenkins. Proceed, Your Honor." Judge Whitman nodded gratefully and opened his folder. "I have uncovered significant evidence of racial bias in Mr. Thomas's original trial. Furthermore, there are glaring inconsistencies in the witness testimonies that were never properly addressed." As he spoke, he presented document after document, each one painting a clearer picture of the injustice that had occurred. The courtroom hung on his every word, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. Mr. Jenkins tried to interject several times, but Judge Carlson waved him down. Her eyes were fixed on the evidence before her, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Judge Whitman finished, the courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Judge Carlson. She took a deep breath and looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room. "In light of this new evidence," she said slowly, "I believe we have no choice but to reopen the investigation into Mr. Thomas's case. Mr. Jenkins, I expect your office to cooperate fully with this review." A collective gasp went up from the spectators. Sheila's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Naomi squeezed her mother's shoulder, a small smile playing on her lips. Judge Carlson continued, "Furthermore, in light of these developments, I'm putting Mrs. Thomas's current case on hold, pending the outcome of her husband's review." Sheila's shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. As the courtroom began to empty, Naomi tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, her eyes shining, "does this mean Dad might come home?" Sheila looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and caution. "It's possible, sweetie," she said softly, "but let's not get our hopes up too high just yet. We still have a long way to go." Naomi nodded, but the spark of hope in her eyes didn't dim. For the first time in months, she felt like things might actually get better. Judge Whitman stood before the Judicial Review Board, his face a mask of calm determination. The verdict was swift and unsurprising: suspension from the bench pending a full investigation into his involvement with the Thomas family. As he left the courthouse, a crowd of reporters swarmed around him. "Judge Whitman, do you regret your actions?" one shouted. Another called out, "What do you say to those who claim you've compromised your impartiality?" Judge Whitman raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "I stand by my decisions," he said firmly. "Sometimes true justice requires us to look beyond the letter of the law and see the humanity in those we serve." The public's reaction was deeply divided. Some praised Judge Whitman as a hero, a beacon of compassion in a cold system. Others criticized him for overstepping his bounds, arguing that his actions undermined the integrity of the court. Sheila Thomas watched the news coverage with a heavy heart. "What if we've lost our only chance?" she whispered to Naomi, who sat beside her on their worn couch. Naomi squeezed her mother's hand. "Don't give up, Mom. Judge Whitman won't let us down." Despite his suspension, Judge Whitman refused to abandon the Thomas family. He worked tirelessly from his home office, poring over case files and making countless phone calls to legal experts and advocates. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. Local activists, inspired by his unwavering commitment, began to rally around the Thomas family's cause. They organized peaceful protests, demanding a fair review of Mr. Thomas's case and highlighting the systemic issues that had led to his wrongful imprisonment. As public support grew, Sheila found herself at the center of a movement she never expected. Neighbors she barely knew offered words of encouragement and support. Local businesses donated food and supplies to help her family get by. One evening, as Sheila tucked Naomi into bed, the little girl looked up at her mother with hope shining in her eyes. "Mom, do you think all these people can really help Dad come home?" Sheila smoothed Naomi's hair, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and caution. "I don't know, sweetie," she said softly. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're not alone in this fight." Days after, the courtroom buzzed with tension as Sheila and Naomi sat hand in hand, their eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Weeks of hard work, sleepless nights, and unwavering hope had led to this moment. Judge Whitman, though no longer presiding, sat in the back of the courtroom, his presence a silent show of support. The new lawyer, a young woman named Cherry Chen, stood confidently before the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I present to you irrefutable evidence that proves Mr. Thomas's innocence." As Cherry laid out the case, presenting DNA evidence and witness testimonies that had been overlooked in the original trial, Sheila felt her heart racing. Naomi squeezed her hand tighter, her eyes wide with hope and fear. The prosecutor, looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally stood up. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Thomas." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sheila's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. Naomi looked up at her mother, a smile breaking across her face. The judge nodded solemnly. In light of this evidence, I hereby order all charges against Mr. Thomas to be dropped immediately. Mr. Thomas is to be released from custody forthwith." The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom, but it was quickly drowned out by the sound of Sheila's joyful sobs. Naomi threw her arms around her mother, crying and laughing at the same time. "Daddy's coming home?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Sheila nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She hugged Naomi tightly, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As the courtroom erupted in celebration, Judge Whitman made his way to Sheila and Naomi. His eyes were misty as he placed a gentle hand on Sheila's shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "He's coming home." Sheila looked up at the man who had risked everything to help her family. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We couldn't have done this without you." Judge Whitman shook his head humbly. "You never gave up. Your strength and love for your family made this possible." Naomi tugged on Judge Whitman's sleeve. "When can we see Daddy?" she asked eagerly. "Soon, sweetheart," he replied with a warm smile. "Very soon." As they left the courtroom, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, Sheila felt a surge of gratitude. The long nightmare was finally over. Her family would be whole again. As the courtroom began to empty, Sheila and Naomi made their way through the crowd towards Judge Whitman. Their faces were still streaked with tears of joy, but now they were lit up with smiles of gratitude. Sheila reached out and grasped Judge Whitman's hand with both of hers. "Judge Whitman," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you enough. You brought light to our family when everything seemed so dark." Judge Whitman smiled softly, his eyes warm with compassion. "Mrs. Thomas, you don't need to thank me. I only did what was right." Sheila shook her head, squeezing his hand tighter. "No, it was more than that. You believed in us when no one else would. You saw the truth when others couldn't, or wouldn't." Naomi, who had been standing quietly by her mother's side, suddenly stepped forward. In her small hands, she held a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Judge," she said shyly, holding out the gift, "I made this for you, to say thank you for helping my daddy come home." Judge Whitman knelt down to Naomi's level, his eyes widening in surprise. "Naomi, you didn't have to do that," he said gently. "I wanted to," Naomi insisted, pressing the gift into his hands. With careful fingers, Judge Whitman unwrapped the package. Inside was a handmade card, decorated with colorful crayon drawings. On the front was a picture of a smiling family, Sheila, Naomi, and a man who must be Mr. Thomas, standing next to a figure in black robes that could only be Judge Whitman. "Oh, Naomi," Judge Whitman breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "This is beautiful." Naomi beamed up at him. "Open it," she urged. Inside, in careful child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for bringing my daddy home. You're our hero." Judge Whitman felt a lump form in his throat. He looked up at Sheila, who was watching the scene with tears in her eyes, then back to Naomi's hopeful face. "Thank you, Naomi," he said softly. "This means more to me than you could ever know." As the Thomas family basked in the joy of their reunion, news spread quickly through the small town. Judge Whitman's suspension, which had cast a shadow over his career, was suddenly lifted. The overwhelming public support for his actions had swayed the Judicial Review Board, and they decided to reinstate him immediately. The town buzzed with excitement. People gathered in cafes and on street corners, discussing the turn of events. Many felt that Judge Whitman's compassion had sparked an important conversation about justice and mercy in their community. On a warm afternoon, just days after Mr. Thomas's release, the family made their way to Judge Whitman's office. Sheila held her husband's hand tightly while Naomi skipped ahead, her pigtails bouncing with each step. As they entered the office, Judge Whitman rose from his desk, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Naomi," he greeted them, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful to see you all together." Mr. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes brimming with tears. "Judge Whitman," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to begin thanking you. You saved our family when all hope seemed lost." Sheila nodded, squeezing her husband's hand. "We owe you everything," she added softly. "Your kindness, your belief in us. It changed our lives." Judge Whitman shook his head humbly. "I only did what I felt was right," he said. "Seeing your family whole again is all the thanks I need." Naomi, who had been quiet until now, suddenly piped up. "Mr. Judge," she said, her eyes wide and serious, "does this mean you can keep helping other families like ours?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Judge Whitman knelt down to Naomi's level, his eyes twinkling. "Yes, Naomi," he said gently. "That's exactly what it means. And it's because of brave families like yours that we can start to make things better." The Thomas family exchanged glances, their eyes filled with gratitude and hope. They realized that their story had become more than just their own. It had become a catalyst for change in their community. As they left Judge Whitman's office, stepping out into the bright sunshine, they felt a sense of renewed purpose. Their journey had been long and difficult, but with Judge Whitman's help, they had not only reunited their family but had also sparked a larger conversation about justice and compassion in their town. In the days following the Thomas family's reunion, news of Judge Whitman's further investigations into similar cases erupted across local and national media. The small-town judge who had once been criticized for his involvement with the Thomas family was now being hailed as a hero of justice. The local newspaper, the Daily Chronicle, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Judge Whitman, Champion of the Underdog." The article detailed his tireless efforts to uncover the truth in the Thomas case, and his ongoing work to review other potentially wrongful convictions. Television crews from nearby cities descended upon the town, eager to interview the man who had become a symbol of compassion in the justice system. Judge Whitman, still humble despite the attention, agreed to a few select interviews. During one such interview on the steps of the courthouse, a reporter asked, "Judge Whitman, what made you decide to take such a personal interest in these cases?" The judge paused, his eyes thoughtful. "It was a little girl's words about being hungry," he replied softly. "Sometimes, it takes a child's innocence to remind us of our duty to protect the vulnerable." Social media buzzed with clips from his interviews and quotes from his rulings. Hashtags like Justice with Compassion and Whitman Way trended as people shared their thoughts on his approach to the law. Many of those who had initially mocked Judge Whitman for helping the Thomas family now found themselves praising his decision. Local business owner Nita Miller, who had once criticized the judge's actions, spoke to a group gathered at her coffee shop. "I'll admit I thought Judge Whitman had lost his mind when he started getting involved with that family," she said, shaking her head. "But now I see he was right all along. He saw something the rest of us missed, and he had the courage to act on it." Even some of Judge Whitman's harshest critics on the Judicial Review Board publicly changed their stance. Judge Harold Simmons, who had led the call for Whitman's suspension, held a press conference to address the situation. "While we initially had concerns about Judge Whitman's conduct," Simmons stated, "his recent actions have demonstrated an exceptional commitment to justice. His willingness to look beyond the surface and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves is commendable." As praise poured in from all corners, Judge Whitman remained focused on his work. He spent long hours in his office, reviewing case files and meeting with lawyers who sought his guidance on challenging convictions they believed to be unjust. On a warm Sunday afternoon, the Thomas family made their way up the tree-lined street to Judge Whitman's modest home. Naomi skipped ahead, clutching a colorful handmade card, while Sheila and her husband followed, carrying covered dishes that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. As they approached the front door, Naomi's excitement bubbled over. "Mommy, Daddy, do you think he'll like the card I made?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Sheila smiled warmly at her daughter. "I'm sure he'll love it, sweetheart. It's made with love, just like everything else we're bringing." Mr. Thomas, still adjusting to life outside prison, squeezed his wife's hand. "I can't believe we're here," he said softly. "To think, a few months ago, I was behind bars, and now—" Sheila leaned into him, her eyes glistening. "And now we're all together, thanks to Judge Whitman." They rang the doorbell, and moments later, Judge Whitman appeared. His stern courtroom demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he greeted them with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Welcome, welcome," he said, ushering them inside. "I'm so glad you could make it." Naomi rushed forward, thrusting her card into his hands. "I made this for you, Judge Whitman," she exclaimed. The judge knelt down to her level, carefully opening the card. Inside, Naomi had drawn a picture of herself, her parents, and Judge Whitman, all holding hands under a bright sun. Above the drawing, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Thank you for bringing my daddy home." Judge Whitman's eyes misted over as he looked at the child's artwork. "This is beautiful, Naomi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I'll treasure this always." As they moved into the dining room, Sheila and her husband set out the dishes they had brought: a steaming pot of homemade chicken soup, freshly baked bread, and a sweet potato pie for dessert. "We wanted to thank you properly," Sheila explained, her voice soft with gratitude, "for everything you've done for us." Judge Whitman shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "You don't need to thank me. Seeing your family reunited, that's all the thanks I need." They gathered around the table, the aroma of home-cooked food filling the air. As Judge Whitman looked at the faces around him, Naomi's bright smile, Sheila's grateful eyes, and Mr. Thomas's newfound peace, he felt a warmth in his chest that no legal victory had ever given him. As they began to share the meal, laughter and conversation flowed freely. The once strict judge found himself relaxing, sharing stories and jokes with the family he had come to care for deeply. In this moment, the lines between judge and defendant, helper and helped, blurred into something simpler and more profound: human connection. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Whitman, Sheila, and Naomi, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.